is there. So why is this topic relevant and why are we hosting this event today? There's a number of reasons, primarily, or firstly, in terms of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, that I think everyone is kind of aiming towards at the moment, or a lot of places in the UK are at the very least. There's a few kind of key points within that I think are very relevant towards feminist architecture, including gender equality, obviously, reduced inequalities in general, and no poverty, and sustainable cities and communities. That's kind of the ones that I think feminist urbanism mainly focuses on, but alongside that, it intersects with a lot of the other problems as well. As well as that, there's a lot of push at the moment for gender mainstreaming in planning. So that's the little diagram from Vienna, who are kind of leading the way with that at the moment. And then on a slightly less architectural or urban sense, in March, there was the unfortunate death of Sarah Everard, and I think that has really impacted a lot of feminists and a lot of women and people in general. And there's a lot of push as well. I think it was the day before her death, there was a report issued out that said only 3% of 18 to 24-year-olds have not experienced harassment, which is very shocking. And whilst a lot of people were kind of pushing for politicians and policy in these areas, I think that as contributors to the built environment, we really need to be taking a certain amount of the responsibility and incorporating it within our architecture, urban design, policy, geography, all of it. So yeah, that's just a little bit of summary. Alongside that, a little bit of an introduction to me. So I've been doing a lot of research into feminist urbanism, feminist architecture, and kind of trying to do a bit of an ethnography on what is happening at the moment within feminist architecture. And there's a few key themes that I thought would be interesting to pose. So when you're pushing for a feminist city, I think something that's really important is that everyone feels like they're incorporated. And to a certain extent, it's impossible for us as designers or change makers to know the specific needs of every single community and micro community. So I'm hoping that part of the conversation today will be around kind of community building and community engagement to make sure that a feminist city is one that incorporates the community. Alongside that, a feminist city is one that has a lot of spaces for women, which is a problem at the moment in that a lot of the cities within the UK are historically designed by and for men. So a feminist city needs to understand how to put small interventions within that existing urban fabric that are for women and marginalised communities. And then a final one, which obviously relates to Sarah Everard and everything that I talked about previously, is public space and women's perception of public space. Something that I found out recently, there was I think it was ONS did a survey, and 4 out of 5 women felt unsafe walking home in the dark in a public park, which is a really interesting statistic because I think that's ingrained from quite an early age. And there's a lot of work at the moment. An organisation called Make Space for Girls are pushing for that, because having a bad relationship to public space and green space then majorly impacts your relationship to exercise and obviously your relationship to the built environment. So that's just a few themes that I thought might be important to introduce. And then finally, we're just going to have a little bit of an introduction from each of our speakers. So we have 3 ladies from In the Making, which is a kind of community-based organisation founded by some architecture students in Glasgow. We've got Engender, which is a Scottish feminist organisation. We've got Iveen, who's one of the architects working on East End Women's Museum in London. And we've got Deborah Bloomfield, who is a PhD student at Leeds Beckett and is doing quite a lot of interesting work in what I would class as feminist community engagement. So I'm just going to pass on to each of them to do their little introduction. I think in the making, you guys will probably be first.
That should be working now. Yeah, sorry, bear with us. This is the first time we're presenting about this project. So yeah, in the making, and this is Zoe, Cash is also in the call, and me, Lily. We're some students based in Glasgow, studying architecture, and we're very interested in the idea of co-design and build within the community. So we formed this group earlier this year during the pandemic, kind of out of the lack of opportunities in the traditional sense of an architecture role. And we kind of set out to self-initiate an alternative co-design project with the people that would use it. So we're just going to go through what we've kind of done so far as this organisation. So we approached a charity called Big Noise, who are in Devon Hill, and they kind of provide free music tuition and pastoral care for the young people in their community. And they were really supportive of our idea about co-designing with them as they kind of were focused on the youth voice this year of their kids. And they highlighted the need for an outdoor space because of COVID, and that they had this kind of rundown backyard that they wanted to revamp. Yeah, so we kind of began by consulting the charity and figuring out what they needed. And I think we quickly realized that we didn't want to impose kind of our biases as designers onto them. So while we were like fundraising through GoFundMe and other organizations in Glasgow, we will kind of recognize the limits of what we knew and kind of tried to seek out expert advice and expertise from people who do these kind of projects, which ended up turning into this publication called Make Big Noise, where we've compiled advice and methods and resources that we gain from other people as a kind of resource for other people to pass on to who want to do these kind of projects. And kind of like, despite all of the advice that we gathered, we still needed quite practical guidance in terms of like safety and teaching the young people how to use tools and building with them. So we got Kirsty Castles from Building Together to support us in passing on that kind of practical knowledge as well. So yeah, this was a quote that we felt resonated about, you know, not even though we had a lack of knowledge or a lack of experience, just still trying to have a go at something and being improvisational and experimental, and yeah, seeking out people who do have the skills that we wanted. So our approach to co-design and build was very centered around the design and not kind of being a tool for the community and the user, rather than having, you know, too much control, taking on a role of facilitation. So we ran some fun workshops with the young people at Big Noise, drawing out their ideas and testing options for their space. And as much as it was about physically building, it was about building, you know, relationships with them and the community. You know, we had so much support from the families and the charity. You know, always keeping in mind that it's about their experience that their kids would have over this few weeks that we were with them, rather than the output of the finished architectural product that we would have to give them, but balancing that with a kind of a finished sense of achievement and feeling, you know, empowered and learning some skills. Yeah, so this was a quote from somebody that we interviewed that we think sums up that idea of everybody collectively collaborating into making the design the best kind of thing. So then, yeah, we did 3 weeks working with them, and at the end we kind of came up with this structure that the kids kind of helped come up with and added their creations to. We don't really see it as a finished thing, but we have developed this kind of lasting relationship with the charity, and we're planning to go back and do more and keep improving the space. Yeah, and work with the kids again. It was really fun. Yeah, and I think one of the biggest things we learned was that there's this kind of chain of learning and sharing skills that's really not linear. And what we learned from the people we interviewed, their own set of skills, often knowing more about certain things than we did. And, you know, it was a very back and forth and around kind of exchange. And yeah, the project was really enriched by that, different like collaborative design. So, you know, we as an organization are still in the making of what we are. You know, a few of us are going back to study or working, and we just want to keep doing these kind of workshops and learning. And yeah, really excited to be here and learn about what everyone else is doing and be part of it. Yeah, so to us, a feminist city is an inclusive and supportive environment that promotes care. And through this project, we've become part of an existing community in Glasgow that are implementing this practice daily. And there's just a small list of people in the area that are doing these kind of community projects who have helped us and connected with us. This is a book that Zoe's reading that she really recommends, and an event at the end of the month in Govan Hill if anybody's in the area and wants to come along. So yeah.
Yeah, and then this is just a quote. We could also ask kind of friends and family what they thought made a feminist city, and I just took this from a friend who, at the very end of quite a long paragraph, yeah, said we need to learn from the spaces that allow for the most diversity. Forests, as Vandaya Shiva says, our farms need to be forests, our gardens need to be forests, our schools need to be forests. So maybe a feminist city is a collection of forests. So yeah, and I thought that was a really nice way of looking at it.
I think that's it.
Thanks.
I'm not sure if that was 5 minutes.
Or a bit more.
That was a really interesting, yeah, I think the way that you guys are working with communities is really inspirational. And I hope that you'll take that into your further practice as architects, because I think it's a gap that we really need to be working on. So yeah, thank you very much for sharing it. Next, I think we've got a little intro from Alice from Engender. So Alice, I'll let you go ahead.
Thanks, Kirsty, and thanks for inviting me to talk. So yeah, I'm Alice, I'm from Engender. We're a feminist policy organisation in Scotland, and we talk about women's equality in planning. I'm going to give a sort of very quick intro, whistle stop tour of some of the things we look at this, and then looking forward to sort of delving into some of those issues more deeply and hearing from everyone else as well. So when we look at policy in Scotland, we essentially look at everything, because everything has an impact on women. We live in a patriarchy. Sorry if anyone wasn't aware of that. It's rubbish, but we're fighting to make it better. So we very broadly look at policy. We group it into about 10 areas, and public space is one of those areas. But of course, there's massive overlaps with things like violence against women that we'll talk about. And when we talk about public space, we tend to look at public transport, we look at the internet as a public space, and then we look at planning and the built environment. And that's because women, as we'll know, experience and navigate public space very differently from men. That's because of pre-existing gender stereotypes and roles, things like childcare. It's because of women's employment practices, women more likely to be part-time, less likely to own a car. And it's because planners and decision makers have traditionally deprioritized women's lives and built our places around a sort of default man. And we still very much have this idea that the public sphere is for men and the private sphere is for women. So we sort of work to try and counteract that in our policy and look at how life might be different if those things weren't true. And it was a very interesting thought experiment a few years ago now, just on Twitter, about someone asked women, what would you do if men had a curfew? And the answers were, depressingly banal, like I'd go for a run and I'd listen to music at the same time at 10 p.m, those sorts of things. And for some men, it was an eye-opener, and for lots of women, it was like, how did you not realize that this was our lives? And I think it's a really good example and illustration of how planning it often seems to exist, you know, the same way we see it as the economy. It's sort of a separate thing from our lives, and it's done in, I mean, architects' offices, and it's something we don't involve in, but are involved in. And I think sometimes intentionally so, it's seen as something that's quite complex. But actually, if you ask people, everyone has an opinion on planning, because we all know when a bicycle lane, it's stupid to put a bollard in the middle of a bicycle lane, and we all get frustrated when you can't get a buggy on the bus, and all those sorts of things. So we actually do have a sense of how planning impacts on our lives. So we've been engaging mainly with legislation, looking at the national planning framework. So in the Scottish Government, setting the direction for sort of planning policy for the next sort of 20 or so years. So a really big opportunity to look at ideas around gender mainstreaming, to look at examples from places like Vienna. And it's a really real opportunity to embed ideas around equality, women's equality, also equality for people of colour, for disabled people, for non-English speakers. But there's always a danger with legislation that if it doesn't act proactively, try and help, try and push for equality, there's an assumption that, oh, well, at least it's neutral. It won't make things worse. And we say, no, it will. Actually, if you're not thinking about women at the start of these processes, you will entrench these inequalities and you will make things worse. So we've just essentially been getting quite angry, but we have had some successes. So the National Planning Framework does now include a statement on advancing equality and non-discrimination on the face of the bill. So it says that that's actually a purpose of planning. It's not just that planning can, as a side effect, help equality. It's one of the reasons we build things. It's one of the reasons we make things and think about our space, is to try and advance equality. So obviously that's just words, and words can be empty. But it is really exciting to have that legislative backing, that we can say, look, this didn't think about women. You had an equality impact assessment for this, in which you said you knew it was going to be rubbish for women, and you still went ahead and did it. So we're sort of now in the next phase of, I suppose, constant vigilance to say, look, you said you had the high ideals, Scottish Government, you said you recognised all of this and we needed feminist planning, and sort of now we're at the stage of trying to make sure that happens. So yeah, really looking forward to tonight and talking more about good examples, and also hearing people's ideas about what needs to be done. Thanks.
Thanks, Alice. Yeah, I think the work that you guys are doing is really interesting, and I think it's really important. The way that you're kind of wording it is something that I wouldn't necessarily have thought to say, if you know what I mean, but the way that you put it, as us as kind of designers or geographers, urban designers, whatever, kind of claiming ignorance is bliss isn't the case. You know, we're supporting inequality by ignoring it, and I think that's really important across all legislation and designs ever, really. By just claiming ignorance is bliss, or claiming naivety, or you didn't know, is just as much of the problem as the spaces that we kind of actively pinpoint. So thank you. Next, we've got Iveen from the East End Women's Museum project. So I'll let you go ahead. I think you've got a good presentation for it.
Hello, so yeah, my name is Aveen. I'm from Manilow and White Architects, and I'm here today because I've been working on the East End Women's Museum, which will be in Barking in London in 2022. I work with another woman called Lauren Lee Porter, who sends her apologies from Greece. She's sunning herself at the moment, so she gets a pass today. So basically, yeah, Kirsty reached out to us after we set up an Instagram page where we were looking at and kind of asking the questions about how we could potentially procure this project, because as a women's museum, and as the only women's museum in England currently, we thought it would be very appropriate for a team of women to build the project. As you're probably aware, that would be probably a first in the UK, maybe in the world. So it's something that we are looking at the moment, and we are striving to do. But I was going to give you a little bit of background on the East End Women's Museum first as an introduction. So as I said, it's the only only women's museum in England, and currently operates as a pop-up, hosting different events throughout the country. And it was formed as their response to a museum founded by a man who basically was promising a women's museum, but then decided that a museum dedicated to Jack the Ripper and the stories of women who were murdered would be a much better selling point. So in 2015, a tweet went out, and they said, you know, really, is this good enough? And that's how the museum was founded, which is, you know, a very, very modern way to start a museum, effectively. So they've, as I say, they've been operating since 2015 and have done really great work within lots of different communities. This is some of the team here. We won the architectural competition in March this year, so we've been working with them since then. We have a nearly all women team, which is brilliant. We have one man, a mechanical and electrical engineer, and everyone else, all the other teams led by women. This is actually the client organization, and it represents people from all different backgrounds. We've got a great kind of stakeholder group who are monitoring our work at all different levels. This is the team here. So yeah, we are currently kind of at stage 3 of design development, which is great. So I'm just going to show you some of the images of what we've been doing. But what we've been trying to do while we develop the project really is kind of raise the profile of the museum. And we've been doing this with kind of trying to get it into architectural press and attending different events. And then again, we founded this Twitter or this Instagram page called Women Building Women's Buildings. And it was a bit of a call out from us to say, you know, we know there's tradeswomen out there, we know there's women working in construction, but how do we go about procuring a team? Because the problem from our point of view seems to be, while the skills are in the network, there's not necessarily kind of medium to small scale women-led contractors or all women teams doing work. And from what the response that we've gotten, it's not to say the demand isn't there, it's just that it hasn't really translated into being structured at the moment. So it's something that we're looking at through this project. This is the museum location. It will be in Barking as part of a new residential development. And from a policy point of view, it's quite interesting because the lease was negotiated as part of a SIL agreement, so Section 106. So the council negotiated this with the developer. So this is why this space was made available. So from our point of view, we think this project kind of sits between two different things, one that reaches out to the community and really wants to draw the community into the development and building of this museum space. But in some ways they wouldn't have got a physical home if it hadn't been for policy and some of the things that Alice, you've touched on there. I think it's, you know, it's very important that at all levels, the issue of feminism and urbanism needs to be tackled. I mentioned, you know, that we want women to be involved in building the museum, and it's our understanding of policy that there's a call for equality in the workplace to build projects like this, but the pressure isn't always put on contractors to fulfill those obligations. So that's something that we'll also be looking at in the building of the museum. The other aspect about the museum that's quite interesting is that it doesn't want to be a traditional museum. It's more about engaging the community and having activity space. The East End Women's Museum doesn't actually have a physical collection. It's about sharing, representing women's stories, both historic and modern. One of the interesting facts that I learned working on this project, and one of the reasons it's so important to have a women's museum, is that less than 0.5% of recorded history is about women. So it's not, as you say, you can't be passive in your reaction to museum and recording history. This is something that needs to be actively tackled. So we've got 3 different spaces. We've got a project room, which the kind of long table-based activities. We've got a space for different events and exhibition, and then we've got a quiet room. And there's quite a complex and detailed brief. The client group is very ambitious about what they want to achieve, so we've been working hard with them to develop something that is really flexible for their needs. And again, we have some decent accessible washrooms with baby change facilities and things like buggy storage as well, and it's something that we're very mindful of as a female and women designers. So I'm just going to flick through some kind of our initial visuals that we've been developing with the client. The different spaces of being inhabited. this is that end space. You know, this could be used as an exhibition or an event space, and we're really trying to make it as flexible as possible at the moment. And then this here really is just to kind of finish. I've kind of touched on it already, but we really are delving into the different possibilities for how we can get this project built. We send Kirsty Castles a message actually as well, but I think she might be a bit far away to come down and work on it with us. But yeah, it's really just, you know, it'd be great to get people's thoughts and opinions on this today. And we've also been speaking to third level organisations, further education colleges, the Mayor's Academy in London, and just really trying to extend our network as far as possible, because it feels like there's a lot of women working very hard in different groups, and it's important that everyone kind of shares the knowledge and shares their experience on how they're trying to tackle these problems, basically. And then these are just finishing on some great consultation sessions that we've had over the last couple of months, speaking to people from all different backgrounds, different like accessible and inclusive workshops, and going to mum and baby groups, and making sure that everyone's voices are heard in the development of the project. Thank you.
Thank you. Something I find really interesting about this project is the way that you've kind of flipped buildings and cities being designed by and for men, and it's by and for women through and through, rather than it being a little bit of a token, oh, this is a women's space. It's completely by and for women, which is just great. And it really shows when you're looking at things with a gendered lens as well, that it becomes an inclusive space for everyone, not just for women. And that's really important in terms of feminist development. So it's a really interesting project. And lastly, we have Deborah. So Deborah, I don't know if you want to go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Kirsty, and thank you everybody for coming together to listen to me and the rest of the panel. Basically, I'm a stand-in for Priya from Bowman Property, so I'm hoping I'll be a suitable stand-in. Now, I don't have a presentation. I'm going to just talk about what it is I'm up to and what it is I'm thinking about. I'm a part-time doctorate student at Leeds Beckett University, and I'm on their Women in Planning cohort. So my thesis will be around the impact of austerity on spatial planning and how it's inadvertently affected women and marginalised communities. Now, I'm going to be tackling the research through the eyes of a woman, because that's what I identify myself as, through the eyes of a Black woman, using feminist participatory methods. I live in an inner city, relatively deprived area of Birmingham. So I'm a beneficiary and a recipient of austerity in spatial planning. Now, when I was thinking about what I'd say for the session, I thought about when I finished my master's degree not so long ago, my master's in urban and regional planning, and I was at an event where quite a senior member of local authority, an employee of local authority, asked me what I'd be doing next. And I talked about, vaguely mentioned feminism and planning. So the person said to me, oh, it's about street lighting and pavements. And I sort of said, yes. And I'm realizing along the journey that it isn't about that. And I'm relatively at the beginning of my journey. I'm a baby at the moment in the research field, but I'm going to talk about something that I think about what a feminist city actually is. And it's not a political thing, but I've been watching the news and the position the situation of the Afghanistan, and in particular the Afghan women. And they interviewed a woman who mentioned the term bread and peace. And I thought, wow, I need to look at that further. Is a feminist city about bread and peace? The symbolism of it, the symbolism of bread and what bread represents, and the symbolism of peace. And also bread and peace relating to the human condition. I'm going through the a grief process because I've lost quite a close member of my family, my mother as a matter of fact. And I was thinking about one of the questions that Kirsty has asked about feminism and engagement. And I thought about the Einstein's ladder of, it's Sherry Einstein, who talks about the ladder of participation. And I thought about that and whether, as urbanists and planners, whether we actually consider the grief cycle and what the grief cycle is composed of, what it, you know, that you start off with anger and then you move towards the various stages where you accept a position, you accept a change in your place. And I'm thinking about the position of whether those two should be combined when one actually thinks about engagement, engaging with communities and allowing a space to grieve, and whether grief is actually part of a feminist city. It's an intangible, it's an intangible aspect. I also thought about this and some of the questions that Kirsty put forward. And I actually thought about what is a feminist city? Again, for me, it's a feeling. It's not just about what the feminist city looks like. And I think we've got a way to go. And with gender mainstreaming, I know that when that official, quite high up official, said to me about the planning and the street lights, I thought, well, there is actually a lack of gender mainstreaming, thinking about the importance of gender. So it's a feeling for me. It's how do you feel when you move in that space? Another thing that's come up that's quite interesting for me is the RTPI have recently released a report about, it's called Urbanization, Displacement and Urban Planning. And it's taking the humanitarian approach. It's talking about displaced communities. And I wonder if that actually applies to develop environments. How do we deal? How do we practice humanitarianism to displaced communities? I'm thinking about looking at the work of someone called Eric Klinsberg, who's written a book called Palaces for the People, when he talks about the importance of social infrastructure. So when we change places, when we develop places, what is the social infrastructure? One thing that I'm fascinated by is that sometimes there can be an intent to impose a social infrastructure without looking at that legacy of the social infrastructure of the old place. How do we recognize and carry the social infrastructure that already existed through to the new place? And how does that connect with the elements of engagement with what I'd like to see a possible combination between the grief cycle and also the Einstein's ladder of communication, of engagement. I'd like to see, I'm thinking about looking at, when we talk about austerity, when we talk about engagement, and when we talk about place building, the impact of participation and inclusivity, inclusive cities and participation, and how communities are actually grasping the nettle and making changes themselves. How are they supporting their communities in the era of austerity, because we've been in austerity for over 10 years. How are we supporting our communities, and whether that support can be classed as a feminist approach? And I think that's me, really.
Thank you. That was great. I think a lot of what you talk about in terms of feminist city being a feeling really resonates. I saw that like everyone else on the panel nodded when you said that. And I think that is very true. And I think the same with, you know, community engagement and participation. I think as much as that's about a feeling as well, but it's really difficult. And I think one of the things that we probably face as architects and designers is how that translates within what you're designing. How do you kind of induce that feeling? Because we all want it, or at least everyone here probably does. It's just yeah, how do we then begin to put that within our designs? I think that Avian, you've talked quite a lot about that within your spaces. I think that's quite an interesting take on it. And I think that, I don't know, I want to maybe just pose the question of what everyone thinks in terms of mixed use as a way of doing that, and that adaptable space and mixed use can bring on that feeling a little bit more. People feel like they have a place within a space if it's got more use. There's quite a lot of theology at the moment around public place being a mixed space. In Barcelona, I think they've made all of their streets pedestrian so that it's more of a mixed use development in itself. And I've seen quite a lot of push for mixed use within historic cities as a way of overcoming cities being designed for the kind of male route home rather than the female route home that perhaps has more stops or has to go pick up children, etc., etc. And yeah, I wondered what everyone kind of thought of as mixed use as a way of engaging a little bit more with that.
Do you want us to just jump in? Or, yeah. So, I mean, yes, absolutely. But I do have a bit of an issue with the term, and not to get into the semantics of mixed use, because actually that's just normal use. And I think the problem is that when we have things that aren't mixed use, that's actually just making women's lives really bloody difficult. It's, yeah, needing to find a buggy park, or needing to drop a kid off before going somewhere because it's not child friendly, or avoiding a cobbled route because you're pushing someone in a wheelchair. So I think, yeah, I think it really just speaks to that idea, as you said, that we have this idea of a commute, yeah, that is 9 to 5 and doesn't involve multi-trip chaining to drop people off at nurseries and various things. And if that's the way we do it, is by talking about mixed use, then I'm all for that. But I do think it speaks to the situation we're in, that we think people's lives you can only have one mission. When has anyone ever gone and done an errand and not just done the one thing and come home? I mean, our lives are mixed use, and our spaces need to be as well, I suppose.
Yeah, I've seen quite a lot about mixed use as a way of overcoming, Jane Jacobs wrote a lot about how the eyes on the street make people feel like they're more safe because they're part of the community if people are overlooking. And I've seen quite a lot about how mixed use can help overcome that as well, because your spaces are always being used throughout the day for different purposes, whether that's public space or I don't know, like a mixed use cafe that turns into a bar. So you aren't having an area or a district that is virtually derelict between 6 p.m. and 8 a.m. And vice versa. You know, I think, yeah, it's quite a useful tool in that sense. But you're right that mixed use development is probably everything, or even in the life cycle of a building. I'm sure every building is mixed use as well.
I think just to jump in on that, I think like the pandemic has obviously shone quite a sharp light on that, where, you know, living in London, there's parts of the city that have just been completely empty, like down in Canary Wharf. You just walk around there and you go, oh my God, like this just doesn't make any sense at all. Just big blocks of money piled up very high. And I think what Alice said about mixed use, it's a good point. It's just everyday life, isn't it? And you mentioned Vienna when you were chatting about it there. I've been reading up on that recently. One of my colleagues was saying the kind of ideas that were just embedded in that, naming all the streets after women, straightforward. But yeah, very much just considering that it's not a 9 to 5, I'm off to work, I'll see you later, I'll see you tonight for dinner, one stereotypical type of family or type of person who lives in a city.
Yeah, and I think the point Kate just put in the chat, so she says, always interested in what makes people feel that passive surveillance will be on their side. So teenagers, homeless folk, people of colour, you know, often surveillance is against them. And I think that goes back to the idea of a feeling, which I really relate to, Deborah, when you said that, because I was thinking, oh God, what does a feminist city look like? I feel like we're so far away from that, I can't even think in positives. But that feeling of being counted and being prioritised in that space is really important. But yeah, how do we measure that? One person's feeling of security and another person's feeling of surveillance. And you see that a lot with a sort of interesting design of tower blocks, where there's, oh look, we've put lots of like nooks and corners in so that it looks interesting, and that's terrifying to walk through. I don't want any dark corners when I'm walking through a place. So yeah, I think that's just want to flag that as an interesting point. And also mixed use, you know, we also do need spaces where we need women-only spaces. They should be trans-inclusive, but we need women-only spaces. We need spaces that are built for particular groups of people who are have been overlooked in society as well. So yeah, I guess there's a balance there. But yeah, absolutely, about, you know, making use of places that aren't being utilised, for sure.
It's even just kind of solidifying the presence of women within spaces. You know, when every street's named after a man, it's easy to forget, for some people, I'm sure, that women are part of the space as well. And talking about Vienna, that's a really good example of it. I was looking into Vienna as well recently, and they have quite kind of, I don't know, it's maybe slightly romanticized, but they have traffic light, all their traffic lights have queer couples on them, I believe, so that queer people are rooted within the heart of the city, and they're seen on every street in the city as a kind of, a way of making people feel like they belong. I think a successful city anyway should be somewhere that people feel like they have a place. And I know that, Deborah, you do quite a lot of work in that area, and that's part of the problem with austerity, is that people begin to feel disconnected to the city that they're living in. I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
I've just got one point. Rebecca Solnit will be one of my favorite authors, and she's written a few kind of pithy lines on it. She said that a horde of dead men live with live identities, haunt New York City and almost every city in the Western world. Streets, buildings, and statues. You know, you go to New York and the Statue of Liberty, but women are seen as like allegories and nobodies. They're mothers and muses. And I think that's a really interesting physical representation of how women are seen versus how men are seen in just very subconsciously as you walk around and take in the city's fabric. I feel like these are, you know, kind of physical things. And for me, as you mentioned, Deborah, getting focused on pavements and street lighting, and it all feels quite defensive. And in some ways, it's to do with the structure of the planning authorities and the people who actually develop the policy. That's kind of an interest, maybe potentially more interesting to kind of move on to.
I'm not sure if the girls in the making have any thoughts, but in terms of everything kind of, yeah, showing or expressing that spaces are for men kind of historically, I think in translating a feminist city, or what does a feminist city look like, I was talking to Charlotte at the Academy of Urbanism, who's in here. You might see her commenting about what a feminist city would look like, and she quite rightly said it probably wouldn't actually look all that different. So I don't think it necessarily would, yeah, come down to pavements and stuff, but it's a matter of changing the mindset, but also managing to put small things within our existing fabric or urban grain that allow people to feel like they're safe and welcome, and that they've been considered. I don't know if, I think that was something that you probably worked on a little bit within your project as well.
Yeah, I think even we were talking about it a bit earlier, and we're like education and like where working with children is really important, because you know from an early age you can agree, like can kind of or like highlight to them that they can partake in with it, like to their environment, and that they have a say over their environment. And that's so like that's such an important kind of realization almost, to then make sure that everyone can have their say and be included. So I think that's kind of what we were thinking.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
like, yeah, and you know, it comes.
Sorry, no, go on, sorry.
No, I was just going to say, and then, you know, that has to happen within schools, and, you know, the way schools are set up doesn't, you know, doesn't encourage that at all. And there's still this really top-down approach, and there's not really space for, yeah, for kids to kind of, I suppose, like celebrate the diversity among themselves, because they're kind of so trained to be these kind of, kind of, I don't know, I don't want to say robots, but it's just like, yeah, it's like, I feel like it starts so early of like how, yeah.
To feel like you have a say.
Yeah, say, and also, yeah, and also kind of the diverse, and understanding that there's such a diversity within a city.
Yeah.
And that can then kind of come out in the fabric.
Yeah, I think it was really apparent when we were working with the kids, and you know, it was quite interesting to see how they participated at the very beginning, and then how open they became by the end of the process. And I just had a thought now that, you know, there was such a huge change within a relatively short time for them, just because they were given that opportunity and chance to really be vocal about their ideas of what they want to do. And I'm just thinking what it would have been like if they were taught that from the very early age, and what if everybody was you know, taught that at the beginning, and you know, the results, they would have been incredible. Yeah, it was definitely a great experience to be a part of, to see that change.
Deborah, is that something you've noticed within your research as well, in terms of engaging with communities and feminist participatory methods, that it's, yeah, bringing that idea to people that their voice kind of matters, and they gain confidence in their opinions?
Yeah, for me, I think it's in terms of, if we put feminism and participatory methods to one side, although it's part of this discussion, for me, it's meeting people where they are, and communities take generations. They can take generations to develop. So I mentioned legacy earlier on. I think for me, it's important to understand and appreciate the legacy of what was in that community and how that community has developed. And then also it depends on what the definition of a community is, because you can have, as you know, diverse communities. One community may have their own sub-communities. So in one small area, there may be several hundreds of people who live there who describe themselves as being in different communities. So it's also what is a community. Also, you have transient communities, you know, because of the housing situation, because of new arrivals coming into a community, all that change. So it's dynamic. The idea of community now is dynamic. Where I live, there's been a historical grounding of a community, but also the community is becoming more dynamic, it's changing. So when we engage with people, it's important to meet them at where they are. So you appreciate, and that's part of feminism, appreciate that person for what it is they have, no matter how small or large, what it is they have to contribute to that particular situation. And it's also, when we engage with communities, it's at what stage, where do we come in? Do we come in from the inside, or do we meet them on the periphery of that engagement process?
Yeah, I think a lot of that speaks really to the heart of some of the issues around consultation in, I mean, all things, but I think particularly it's true in planning, in the time poverty, the financial poverty that women experience far more than men. And so any sort of non-gendered consultation process will see white men who are disabled having hugely more influence. And that's something we really need to grapple in when we look at things like participatory budgeting and community voting on things, because as you say, Deborah, who is the community? How do we define that? Transient populations shouldn't have less of a say, but also who has the time to read these proposals, to go to the county office, to come to a Zoom event, all these sorts of things. So there's a real danger that just the usual suspects continue and we end up with more and more sort of male-coded design and projects, and women being shut out. But I also think we need to, the idea of it being dynamic, I really like, because it's often that thing. So I'm a cyclist, I don't drive, and when I cycle around the city, I just think, my goodness, if I could get on a tandem with the city planners and all drivers and show them like what it's like to be a cyclist in the city, they would not be so anti-segregated cycle lanes and not so pro cobbles, you know. But that idea of actually, as I said earlier, like, you know, women are experts in navigating a city that is not built for them, because we've all done it for generations. So consultation isn't about saying, here's some plans, can you say which of these two binary options you like? It should be a living process. I really like the idea of prototype spaces and the things you were talking about, Aileen, of you know, building with the space and evolving with the space, and it not being an idea that we think you should do this, and if the community don't want to do it, you know, why not have temporary paths, and then when you've seen the pixie paths that people like to make, put those in as the permanent paths, you know, see what actually works. And you know, I think you were saying, Kirsty, about things not being design failures, you know, communities changing and communities evolving, and us not being able to make people act in a certain way. So yeah, I think that's really talking about the stages of participation. Like, it needs to be embedded right at the start, and it needs to be good, intersectional, thorough participation, but it also doesn't end when the thing is built or when the space is designed.
I think yeah, that's exactly what the East End Women's Museum are you know, trying to do. And I think a big part of how they've been so successful is the fact that they didn't actually have a home for 6 years. So the very nature of how they've operated, having pop-ups in the East End, like in Hackney and Terra Hamlets, directly in the community, stands to them, and they know they've got this network already. And one of the things Rachel Crossley, the director, says a lot is something you've just said, Deborah, which is go and meet people where they are. And it stood to me when she did the first introduction to the project before we had won it. I was like, that I've never heard someone in a museum say that as clearly and upfront. So yeah, I think the whole thing for the museum is that, there's not a collection, and it should change and respond. And that's what we're working through at the moment, ideas on how you capture what people are feeling in the community and what they want to see in their local museum, and be involved in it. There's this question of like, people, are you an observer or are you the curator? And I think there is a kind of group of new museums being developed that are looking at that. They don't want to be the British Museum having stolen things from, well, should I say stolen, taken things from other parts of the globe and put it in a big building. So I think that's kind of the direction, and it kind of feeds in, it's one small museum, but it could feed into the approach for different things, different scales of things within the community.
I think that also. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Just add, sorry, just a couple of a quick sentence. It's important to recognise the skill and the contribution of local people by paying them time.
Yeah.
By paying them. So, is it possible to develop local curators and developers and pay them? That's where the childcare comes in. Sometimes you'll have an event and someone can't come because of childcare. It doesn't have to be a woman, but someone can't come because of childcare.
Yeah.
What is there available to support people to come to events?
Yeah. I think what we've done at the moment, we've got the Zoom events, and we've tried to be flexible around people's schedules. So we're kind of doing them at this time of the evening and things like that. But one of the things that has come up, is women are just very conscious of their time. Like, time was one of the things that's come up over and over again, and it's precious. So I think, I'd love to be in a position that we could offer, to pay curate, to pay for different levels of consultation. But I wonder, is that something that needs to happen on a policy level? I don't know how that could be developed. It's an interesting point, though.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the move to lived experience and panels, which is absolutely right, and lived expertise. You're completely right, Deborah. It doesn't work if we're asking people to volunteer their time. Paying costs is still sometimes just that should be completely standard, but that's still unusual sometimes, that people are expected to give their expertise. And also, we're talking about, we talked at the start about trigger warning, like a big issue, although it's not just streetlights and pavements. It is streetlights and pavements in many ways. And, we're asking women to re-traumatize themselves. We're asking disabled people to talk about how difficult their lives are and how difficult we have made their lives by not planning for them. And, I don't think paying people is just the answer to that, but it should be the first step. And I also think that something about that meaningful consultation, and certainly in like policy land, there's a lot of consultation fatigue. And it's like, well, we've been, there's a new race equality framework every 3 years with a consultation. Like, we know what the problems are in Scotland. We know where the racism is. We know how to solve it, and you're not doing it. So don't just ask people if you're not going to do anything with the answers. And I think that was when you were talking from In the Making about, children being involved. And, there's so many, particularly with children, but also I suppose women to a certain extent, reasons that things are the way they are because of safety, where you have to wait at the traffic lights because there's cars coming, these sorts of things. So knowing the difference between those things that can be changed and those things that can't is really helpful, but also seeing that those ideas you have, all those things, actually come into play is really, really important, because otherwise people won't bother engaging anymore. Even if you're getting paid, even if you're having a nice time in tea and cake while you're talking about the design of Newkirk Gate in Leith, like I'm not going to keep coming back and saying the same stuff if you're clearly ignoring me. So I think that's why I say meaningful participation. we have to know what the parameters are. Don't say we can ask for something we're not going to get, but be honest about that. You know, if you have a priority for a space and it's not going to, you know, you've already committed money or you've already got a certain person on board, so you're not going to change it that much, just tell us, and we won't waste our time.
Yeah, something I've noticed, just when you mentioned Leith there, I live in Leith, and there's a lot of regeneration at the moment in the area, a lot of work being done by planners with what I believe to be the best intentions, but I don't think you could speak to a single person in Leith that is happy with the decisions that have been made. And it's going back to what you've said, Deborah, like the community in Leith, I'm not from Leith, but the community in Leith is so historic and it's so like tightly intertwined that it's really frustrating that these people feel like they aren't being listened to, you know, like families that have lived in the same area or the same street for generations, and yet they feel like they're not part of the process, or they have no voice in the decision making, and it just results in so much anger. There's a Facebook group for people that live in Leith, and it's a nightmare because it's just constantly people sending photos of stupid decisions that have been made. And I just feel like as planners and architects and everyone and policymakers, we really need to be, there shouldn't be a need for any of that, you know, like we should be, you're never going to please everyone, but you don't want to make everyone mad at the same time, you know. It's really, yeah, it's frustrating, and I think that a lot of that comes down to engagement and people feeling like they aren't going to be listened to anyway, so not even really bothering to turn up for any of the consultations because everything's already been designed without them in mind. So I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think what we were talking about earlier as well, that idea of in terms of like the consultations, like not just going in with a kind of extractive mindset that we're going to, you know, engage this community, but take their ideas and not really give anything back in that situation. And I think a lot of what we were trying to do was make it fun and do activities and share skills and build up different ideas at the same time as that consultation. It's all kind of the same thing. It's being part of their community and not just going in and coming out and then taking and leaving, and kind of having a longer lasting relationship. Yeah, I'm not sure where that goes further down the line, but with the intention of not just coming in.
And I think it's also, we were super lucky to have a client, the charity, that kind of, they were super open, and also they were like, just do what the kids want, and if they don't, like, because they, like, the charity were like, we need space to play outside. Ideally it's got a cover and it can be protected from the rain, but at the same time they were still like, if the children don't want that, like, then that, you know, it's fine, because we are promoting this voice, and like, you know, so it was, so to have that is, so I think is quite unique, because I think a lot of, you know, development within the city, it's like the client needs something, and they've, you know, the developers knows they need to develop something, and the way, because we work in a capitalist society, it's like, you know, we're set up that things need to be built, and there's time and there's money, and spending more time costs more money, and like, yeah, you need these outcomes. So I think it's like there is in a way like a kind of need for restructuring in that, to really value, because otherwise you do end up with like places like Leith where no one's happy, and it's just like, yeah, it's kind of like needing to move away from I don't know, I think like seeing growth like in the capitalist way is like more shifting to the kind of well-being economy, and focusing on that is like a really big thing.
Yeah, when we were discussing it earlier on, what Zoe mentioned about living in a capitalist city or capitalist world, when we were trying to define what a feminist city is to us, one of the first things that we came up with was that it is anti-capitalist, and that's probably the best description that we, you know, besides other things, but that was one of the main points for us, that we really have to move away from it to properly make change and focus on more important issues than just money making.
I think as professionals as well, within professions that have generally been dominated by privileged men, it's easy to cut, or it's almost within our education, particularly as architects, that everything is egotistical, and you have a style and you need to impose your style on the project. You can't mold yourself to the project has to mold itself to what you want. And I think that is probably part of the problem, in that I know within the 6 years of architecture education, not once did we get told that about community engagement or effective community engagement. For no project were we told to go and kind of speak to the community, and a little bit within my last year, but other than that, there was no there was no prescription to do that. So I think that has just ingrained that architects and urban designers can impose their ideas on communities, and I think that is probably one of the problems that needs to change. And I think that is probably also partly down to everything being a bit capitalist, but that's maybe a whole other discussion.
And I think to defend sort of planners and architects, that it's part of the problem is in policy land and at like local council level, absolute decimation of staff. So where you would have had specialists and where you would have had time and money to do consultation or think about these things, it's gone. But also the fact that it is, from my impression of it, is a sort of non-holistic process. So you might have, as you say, the absolute best intentions and design something, but then it goes to a different department that's looking at, well, okay, how it interacts with, I don't know, the city sewers or the road systems, all these sorts of things. And then it goes to people that are looking at the cladding and all these other things. And this is where corners get cut, and and I mean, look at Grenfell. Like, cheap and non-person centered planning results in murder of poor people, essentially. But also it just means that an idea that came about either because it came from the community, or it was just a really nice idea, or something that the architect or the planner felt, gets that doesn't get carried through, that intention. And so you end up with something that maybe doesn't match, or an idea that would have had disabled access if it had this particular handrail that they decided to take out, anything like that. So I think there's also something about that not seeing that through road, and that again goes to having participation embedded at the start and throughout, and having gender mainstreaming and other forms of equality mainstreaming embedded throughout. So you can't have these disconnects, which come by accident and only are realised when someone's trying to actually use the space and they say, this doesn't work for me.
Can I just add a couple of comments? Yes, I completely agree. But in participation costs, so there's a big cost element, isn't there? And also the built environment, although you have your professionals, there's also a political element to it. So the politicians' effect can influence what happens to a place. And that's just my view. It's political as well as financial. That affects the way that things are done and not the way things should be done.
100%. And I think the Vandana Shiva quote about forests is really pertinent here, because we definitely have an attitude, that like growth is good, which I would argue against, but that planning and building, particularly big infrastructure projects, and I use Scottish Government elements of infrastructure, so we're talking about full frame bridges and dualling roads, rather than investing in childcare. Jobs, like job creation, just trumps everything, and it goes back to the capitalist mindset that how communities, the difficulty in communities objecting to projects and looking at things like, we've got someone here from Aberdeenshire looking at Trump's golf course on the many estates, which the government pulled in and overturned the local community decision around that. because it was seen to create jobs, which didn't happen, shock horror. But this idea that jobs, and again, traditionally male coded jobs, so building, engineering, architecture, are created by these projects, and not actually thinking about, okay, well, if we want to create jobs, let's have more nurseries, and we can build those nurseries and we can make them spaces that people need. So I think you're absolutely right, Deborah. It's like political decisions all the way.
Just working on this project over the last year or so, I've really started to think about, you know, the male dominance within the construction environment has always been there. Like, it's not, you know, it's not news to anybody, but it does make you think, you know, very simply, and it's not a simple thing to implement, if the construction industry was more balanced, you know, just going onto a building site and seeing half of the construction labor being women, I think it's kind of silly to overlook that and think, oh, it's a male job. Traditionally, there's plenty of women who would have independence, you know, maybe he wouldn't have, you know, they haven't gone to college, but there's this really well-paid jobs, and they're not potentially dependent on their husbands or in these more traditional roles. And you know, there's flexibility in working hours. Electricians, they all rock off at 3. Architects are working till 7 or whatever it is. You know, it's a huge group of people within society, and I think it's something that we need to look at, because we're always told as architects, oh sure, you go to school and it's 50-50, and architecture is generally 50-50, but the second you go and try and build a project, you can very often be the only woman on site, you know. So it is something that's kind of pervasive, I think, and needs thinking about.
And also is, I mean, it's not the answer to it, but it does help with some of the real clangers in design that don't think about women, you know. And you know, it's true in politics and true in lots of careers. Like, actually, if you've had a little bit of life experience and come to these things later, then you will be able to bring some of that, and it shouldn't just rest on the architects and the planners, and we need the consultation. But yeah, it does help that it's not just all from book learning, and you know, again, you can do lots of work, and I think I have done interesting work looking at syllabuses and the gender of authors that you're reading and all these sorts of things. But yeah, as you say, there are many routes, which is really exciting and opens more possibilities, I think.
I think we've only got about 10 minutes or so left, but I just thought I might see if anyone else that's kind of watching has a question that they'd maybe like to pose, or anything that they'd like to bring up. There's been quite a lot going on in the chat, but I don't know if anyone wants to speak. Speak now or forever hold your peace. That's what my mom always says. Yeah, if anyone has anything to add. I'm
not going to put Rachel on the spot here, but I noticed she's just putting something in the comments, and she's the director of the East End Women's Museum. And just to the point that you asked, Deborah, she's clarified that the East End Women's do pay the travel and care expenses of their volunteers, which I think is really amazing, and I should have known that. So yeah, we're really delighted to be working with them as an organisation. They're great. I don't know, Rachel, you want to add anything?
No, I don't think so. Thank you. Just wanted to say hi, and yeah, very interesting discussion. Thanks so much.
Something I thought I might just add in terms of your kind of engagement with the East End Women's Museum is Matrix, the feminist architects firm in the kind of 80s. They had quite an interesting method of engaging with their clients in some of their projects, where it might be something that you've already read, but they took like a room within the space that the client already used, so for example a meeting space within their existing building, and then drew it and modeled it and put it within all of their drawings when they were talking about designs. Because I think, as Deborah was saying, like, meeting people where they're at, it's unreasonable for us to expect that by putting a plan and a couple of visuals up on the board that the whole community is going to understand exactly what that means and what size that is. Like, even from my experience as going through architecture school, it's only when you first go on site that you start to realize how big things actually are, or small things actually are. So I think that was quite an interesting method of doing it, where they took a space that those people understand and are very familiar with, and then it's easier to understand how things then reflect in relation to that, if that makes sense. I don't know if it's something you've worked on yet.
We are familiar with Matrix. Actually, there's kind of a legacy with our practice in Matrix, and we've worked with them quite closely. We've worked with Joss Boyce, who's one of the founding members, who now has Disordinary Architecture. So they've run the accessibility workshops, which are really good. But I think that we haven't done that, but we've got quite a hefty model of the space. So I think we will definitely give that a go as part of our development. Thanks for that, Kirsty.
That's okay. We've got a couple of questions. I don't know who was first. Is it Charnel?
Yeah, hi. I'm actually tuning in from South Africa. I'm an urban designer here. And I think one of the bigger things in South Africa, or maybe cities of the global South, is informality, where the informal sector actually really employs a lot of women, especially uneducated women and skilled women. And that's quite a big thing here. I don't know what that might be like in England or Great Britain, or Europe in general. But I think it could be quite important, especially with more immigrants coming through Europe as well. And that's kind of the easiest way to empower women in our society here, is a lot of informal trading, kind of informal spaces where women can kind of move around a lot, kind of trade at different times of the day. So yeah, that kind of touches again on the economy and capitalism and all of that. So just want to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a huge amount from the sort of Scottish policy context, but I do think it's really interesting to look at how the pandemic will influence planning and space use going forward. So people starting their own businesses from home and people just working from home, looking at mixed use office space, but also where people go for those interactions they may previously have had out on the street. And I think the idea of, and obviously there's a balance to be struck between sort of regulation and in terms of street trading and those sorts of things, and stalls, but also like how we create those spaces for those random interactions that are actually what makes society lovely. And the idea of actually in Leslie Kern's book Feminist City, she talks I was really pleased to see it. So I think there's only about 8 chapters, and one of them is about friends. And I think it's really interesting because we often talk about, the challenges. We do often frame it in terms of motherhood, or in terms of being a spouse or a daughter and offering care. And actually friendship was lovely to be thinking about it in that way. And she talks about the mall, and there's a reason that it's such a cliche that girls go to the mall, and it's not because we like shopping, it's because it's a place where we're safe to hang out, and the equivalent of the barbershop sort of being potentially for men of color in the States, and these sorts of ideas. So I think those informal spaces, whether it's around sort of trade and capitalism, or just around those random interactions that brighten our day, is a really, really interesting thing to look at. Yeah, but it'd be interesting to know more about how South Africa is sort of handling that, for sure.
I think it's also quite interesting when we're talking about kind of the political climate and how that impacts the built environment, that when you take, I don't know, kind of a case study of somewhere that's a very different, even just like climate and a very different culture, and how they're doing something better than us. I think that's always quite an interesting way of looking at it, because it kind of emphasizes the point that politics and our social views play quite a big part on the built environment as well. I think we've just got the last 5 minutes, so I don't know, Amy, if you want to do your question, then that would be lovely.
Hi. Sorry to end on such a big question, I guess, but I think there's such a disconnect between being sat on a call like this with like such refreshing conversations with so many great women who are obviously really thinking about this, and like the day-to-day work that I do with planners, and like just how can we get these conversations being had on like a really granular level. Like, I know there's talk of kind of mainstreaming these issues, but then how does that get fed down into every planning application, every decision that's being made? Like, planning is so, I don't know, I'm not sure whether planning's about people anymore, and how can we get back to that, I suppose.
I always think it's interesting, yeah, you saying that it's a refreshing conversation, but how that then translates. Like, I was talking to a friend recently and being like, we've made such big advances in terms of feminist architecture and blah, blah, blah. And they quite rightly said, I think you need to take a step back in order to understand that there's still quite a long way to go. I think, like, if you're having all these conversations with like-minded people, the same way that I suppose privileged men are having conversations with like-minded people, it's easy not to recognize that other people aren't actually implementing those thoughts, you know. But I personally think that having more women change makers and more women in higher positions will hopefully allow that to feed down. And I believe, although I probably do need to take a step back, that we're making headway in that area, but I don't know.
Yeah, and I think for me, you're right, Amy, this has been an amazing space. And when we were talking about like the feeling of a feminist city, I was like, oh, it's just knowing that this sort of thing of knowing everyone's at least on the same basic page, that, you know, we need to smash the patriarchy. But I think it's really interesting as well that this is not a new conversation. And in fact, at that Matrix exhibition, The Barbican, there was a film from 1947, which was sort of satirical of a man going and consulting women. And it's talking about the steam houses, and he goes into a room of women, and they're all saying it's awful because, you know, that we're supposed to do the laundry in the same place we live, everything's damp, it's horrible and hot and sweaty. And he just says, but wouldn't it be lovely if you all had a communal garden? And they're like, yeah, that'd be nice too. But that's the thing they go with, right? So 1947, there's satire about ignoring women in planning. RTPI brought out a how to gender your planning process in, like, I don't know, 1993. You know, these are not new ideas. So voluntary action is not cutting it anymore. Like, clearly there's amazing people involved and there's amazing individuals pushing, but yes, that won't happen when 29% of local councillors are women, so it's massively dominated by men. The industry is still massively dominated by men. So I think it is things like making equality impact assessments work. Like, you don't get the money if you say if you don't do an EQIA, if you don't bring it out at the same time as your consultation document, and if you say you're going to build affordable housing and then you say, oh dear, we forgot the affordable housing, you don't just get a slap on the wrist, you don't get any contracts for the next 10 years, you know. So I think we know the issues, and actually, whoever said it earlier, ignorance is bliss does not cut it anymore. You know, I think we need to start punishing people that don't care about women, frankly.
Absolutely.
I think it's multi-level, isn't it? Sorry, Kirsty. Yeah, it's got to be on policy level, and it's got to be consultation, and it's got to be with architects, and it's got to be with people coming out of architecture school, like, you know, having these connections with local communities. Because I think the thing is as well, consultation is a real job, and it's really difficult, and it's recognizing that. And, you know, architects a lot of the time get swept along and trying to get fees and just keeping going with the project, but consultation is a real significant role, and then it's that alongside architecture being recognized in policy and there being real punishments. Punishment sounds quite penal. Real implications if it's not done right, I think. Yeah.
Can I just say 2 words?
Mm-hmm.
I think what's missing is education, gender mainstreaming, gender planning issues. When I did my master's degree, which was only in 2018/19, I didn't hear anything about that. So it's education. It's how do we educate the new planner or architect? How do we incorporate these ideas, these important discussions into the curriculum, the degree curriculum? another quick point about the informal women undertaking, you know, small businesses. I mean, it does happen a lot in Birmingham. I think it depends on the area that you go to. What Chanel said, I completely see and I completely understand. That you do have different types of economies within an economy.
Great. I think on that note, we might call it a night. Thank you very much to everyone for coming and for your amazing thoughts. And thank you very much to the speakers for well, everything that they're doing and all the progress they're making, but also for coming and sharing a couple of hours with us. It's really appreciated.